In this last video, we will explore a couple of really interesting compounds that definitely are in our public mind and are not necessarily toxic, but uh, do have some really interesting impacts on the body. And so we'll start by looking at asbestos. Asbestos is just a generic name of a series of compounds that are derived from magnesium silicate. And so when someone says asbestos, we're not talking about a compound in particular, we're talking about a series of compounds. But what's interesting about this particular compound, this mineral, is that when it disintegrates, when it breaks down into small pieces, it can produce these very small floatable fibers that carry the description of being friable fibers or friable fibers. And these friable forms of asbestos are the ones that have particularly dangerous effects on your body. And the reason for that is because if you look at them, the length of a friable asbestos fiber is anywhere between 0.1 and 10 microns, which is just slightly larger than bacteria and slightly smaller than fog or fine sand. Far too small to be seen by the human eye. But if you think about what kinds of places these materials can go, you can see why we would have such problems with it. Because what happens is the asbestos can get into your body systems, and because of its size, it can kind of just wedge itself in there and get stuck. Um, and if it gets stuck, then we start to see other types of issues. And so, what kinds of things can we see? Well, we know that asbestos has a direct link to lung cancer. It irritates the tissues in the lungs. It actually causes them to mutate, and they can start to um, uh, turn into cancer cells from there. Because of the nature of those fibers, the prickliness of them, we can get something called asbestosis, and that's where it's not cancer, but the lungs have been irritated by the scratching associated with the asbestos. And then finally, the one that gets all of the attention, mesothelioma. This is the subject of most of the tort lawsuits that are out there that you see commonly on television. This is a unique cancer. It primarily affects the chest and the abdomen, so your chest and your torso, and it is uh, something that develops over a long period of time. It is nasty, and it can very quickly lead to fatalities um, once it is detected, because it's usually pretty hard to detect initially. Now, in response to these dangers, a number of governmental agencies have banned products containing asbestos. However, asbestos, because of its temperature tolerances, asbestos was a really popular building material. And so many buildings that have not been renovated since probably 1990 contain asbestos. And so long as they stay intact, um, so long as the asbestos is not adulterated in any kind of way, it will be relatively safe where it is. Um, it's when it is uncovered, when it is potentially damaged and has a chance to disintegrate, that is when we have more issues, and that's when we get into issues of abatement. So, for example, a lot of older construction schools, when they get renovated, there's usually a period of time where there can't be people other than workers inside the school because they need to remove all the asbestos and abate it and make sure that it is taken care of properly and safely. And so we've seen this here in Vincennes. The elementary schools have each taken a turn over the past 3 or 4 years, um, where they've been closed down for a year so that they could do a renovation. They're doing a renovation of the school from top to bottom. Now, part of that is to allow every single one of the classroom spaces to be renovated, but part of that also is for safety concerns. I am sure that most of those buildings probably had asbestos in them based on when they were built, and how long it's been since they were renovated. And so that kind of abatement is important. And so when asbestos is present, OSHA requires that the area be posted and that people know about it. The EPA regulates how it gets removed and gets abated. And there are usually sets of PPE and other kinds of things that need to be in use to deal with that appropriately. The other thing that we want to look at here are biological warfare agents, and we're going to talk about two in particular that made some news headlines in the last about 20 years or so. Now, what is a biological warfare agent? Well, these are microorganisms, so living things that cause disease or create toxins that are used to injure, incapacitate, or cause mass casualties. And since they are biological agents, their exposure may not actually manifest themselves for days, because, well, it's a biological agent. It takes time to work into your body and to start reproducing enough that it can cause the kind of injury that is intended. Now, how are these agents dispersed? Well, they can be put into the air, they can be aerosolized, and so sprayed literally on a group of people. They could be put into food or drinking water, or what has been the most common for recent events in our history, they can be put into fabric, paper, or other items. And so, for those that lived through 9/11, you're probably familiar with anthrax. Now, anthrax had a major scare in the months following 9/11. Anthrax is a bacteria, Bacillus anthracis, and it can be put into your body through any of the three routes. Where we saw anthrax used in the days after 9/11, anthrax-coated envelopes were sent to various people in the public eye, including senators, and I believe a news agency and a couple of others. And they were put onto envelopes and the hope that those people would touch the envelopes to get the anthrax and be seriously injured or even killed by it. Now, by far the most lethal form is inhalation, because that gets the anthrax into your lungs and into your bloodstream very quickly. But skin absorption or ingestion, which is probably the way that those envelopes were intended to get it on you, was certainly the most possible. Now, if there is an infectious substance that is being transported from one area to another, it is going to have this placard on it. This is the biohazard placard and the biohazard pictogram that goes along with it. And all responsible shipping is going to have a number of things in it. So you can see that the The actual material here is triple packed. You have the primary container, which is on the inside. It's got absorbent packing material. It's packed inside of a secondary cylinder, which is then packed into a box with the proper labeling of it. And so this is all to ensure that the infectious material on the inside cannot get out, cannot affect the people that are actually responsible for getting it from one place to another. So, uh, for example, if this was sent via FedEx, which it probably wouldn't be, but if it was, it has the proper labeling. If the FedEx truck gets into an accident, um, the infectious material is protected by 3 layers of packing and is unlikely to rupture inside of there. Um, and so that is an obvious precaution there in the event that something happens, even if it crashes into a river or something like that. The secondary packaging is usually watertight to prevent water from getting in and obviously from the material getting out into the water supply also. The other common substance that got some news probably about 5 or 10 years ago, getting into the early 2010s, was ricin. Ricin is not a biological agent in terms of it's not a living thing. It's a toxin that's produced by a plant. The plant is Ricinum Communis. Um, but the toxic material that is produced by this plant can be aerosolized, can be put into a powder form, can be um, uh, put into a variety of different methods. And so the issue that you run into with ricin obviously is it's very versatile, can be administered in a number of different ways, and there's no specific treatment for the exposure. If you get a high enough dose of it, there's no antidote that's known to date. So you just get sick. Um, and hopefully they can treat you enough for the symptoms that it doesn't kill you. But Ricin had its day in the sun a few years ago, kind of in the same mode that we saw with the Anthrax in the early 2000s, where some targeted letters and things were sent out to some important people, and there's a scare for a brief period of time. But this one, unlike the anthrax, where we could develop a vaccine and move on, this one's a little bit more dangerous. There's a little bit more unknown associated with it. So this concludes for us chapter 10 in our look at toxic materials. Um, and so if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. Otherwise, have a good day.